This is the Central Burying Ground, and tonight, the Holliston Historical Society is going to lead a graveyard walk. Joanne, what's happening here?
Well, what's happening here is we're going to visit about a dozen or so grave sites of notables in Holliston. Seems like a good time of the year to do this. Everything is really looking very nice in the burial ground. But people go by this place every day, and if the traffic slows down, you may gaze over and see some of the stones. But did you know about some of the people that you're passing by? Now, we certainly can't visit everybody, but remember one thing. Everybody in this burial ground who's buried here has a story. They have a history. Some of their histories are much bigger than others, but that's why we're going to point out some of the more significant stories that people pass by every day. So next time, if you happen to be slowed down in traffic, perhaps you'll pay more attention to a few of them, especially the notables that are buried here.
Great. History, Halloween, and Holliston. Sounds like fun.
This particular graveyard was mostly the Congregationalists and a few Methodists could sneak in. But first of all, though, the first person that we're going to talk about is Joseph Mellon. You will find him on your sheet. And as you can see, he has a veteran's flag, and also the dates would put him squarely within the Revolutionary War era. Lieutenant Joseph Mellon died November 12, 1787 at the age of 49 and 8 months. They're very precise back in that day. Now, why did I choose Joseph Mellon? It wasn't only because of his veteran status or his lovely carved stone. This is a wonderful thing. But there's another reason why. Has anybody read the book Blue Highways by William Least Heat Moon? Well, it was written back in the 70s, and I would really urge you to read that book. It is still in print. It's still available. The reason is that the author, who was traveling around on the blue highways of America, just happened to come through here and stop. First of all, apparently he went down to the Superette for a sandwich and a can of Moxie, which he does describe in his book, and he walked through this graveyard. And he found this stone of Joseph Mellon. What William found really impressive about this stone was not only the carving itself, but the poem that is written on the bottom. You will find throughout the cemetery many gravestones that have 4 or more lines of poetry at the bottom. And this particular 4 lines that he has on his is one of the more classic poems. It's one that you will find probably on a dozen or so stones around this particular yard. Anyway, the poem is, "Behold and see as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you must be. Prepare for death and follow me." Sounds very uplifting, doesn't it? So he was quite impressed with this. Now, and also he stated, back in the 70s, there was a thing, a little bit of a fun thing around that time where people were doing a lot of grave rubbings in the area. He happened to find a half-done gravestone rubbing of Mr. Mellon, which he kept and posted in his van as he continued on his travels, and Joseph Mellon and his beautiful winged effigy followed him for the rest of the trip. So Joseph Mellon, you live on. So, next we are going to go this way. You will only find this particular angelic carving in towns around here, Holliston, Medway, North Bellingham. It does not really reach out further than that. So we presume that it is done by a local carver. But when you get a chance, take a look closer at it and see what the difference is between the winged effigies on the stones. It went through several transformations. And the reason why I really like this one is that if you notice up close, they have carved in eyelashes, I love the spit curls, including the angel wings, and she's smiling. She is not a skull and crossbones, as you will find on many of the others around here, but it is a truly lovely carving. And there's about a half dozen or so of these. So, next, these old stones along here, many of them were for the 1750s era, including, here lies the body of Solomon Park, A.B. Even has his college degree on the stone. He did graduate from Harvard. He was one of the victims of the great sickness which occurred in Holliston in the winter of 1753. And a lot of these stones are depicted by that. The problem is that this might be a foot stone. You will notice on a lot of graves around here that many of them have two stones. One is a head and one is a foot. Many of the foot or head stones have disappeared and leaving just one behind. So the thing is, now if you look all around this cemetery, one thing you might notice is that most of the stones face east. Anybody know why that was? Yes, that's right, because when the resurrection comes, you sit up in your grave and you're looking east. Sometimes it makes me wonder, you know, poor Peter Larkins are faced this way instead, which may be because of head and foot stones. And the very last grave marker, we will see about that and cause a little bit of discussion about it, just how that happened. Anyway, so poor Solomon Park. But behind here, that grave marker that you see here, which is to James Russell, quite ostentatious. Very few of this type of grave marker was done around this part of Massachusetts, but it does denote that this person was really quite prominent in town history. And as we read down through it, this is all of his accomplishments. One thing that they don't mention, they do mention that he was a deacon of the church, perhaps in very high standing in the community, but actually his occupation was tavern owner. And a tavern owner is probably just as important in a small colonial town as the minister, who we will meet later. So here he is, James Russell, Esquire. Yes, now, the thing is, he also has a 4-line poem at the end of his, too, and if you can look at it, the stroke.
Oh, the stroke of death.
Hath
laid my
bead. I have no idea why that is.
Down into this dark and silent
bed.
Yep.
God's trump!
Shall found
I hope to rise
and meet my Savior in the skies.
In the skies. Now, God's trump, actually it's just the shortened word for trumpet. Yeah. But good grief, it does crop up. The shock of it all. Yes. So, good old James Russell has really got a very important place in the history of Holliston as well in this burial ground. So, next though, what I do want to do is just back a little bit. He's very important here. But there is another one right behind. This is the gravestone of Nancy Dickinson. Her little brother John is next to her, but Nancy Dickinson died at the age of 16. She is the daughter of the minister Timothy Dickinson. Timothy Dickinson, who we will meet later, was the grand uncle of Emily Dickinson. So for some little, sense of perspective and all. The reason why I have chosen Nancy is that in the packet of papers you will receive will be some excerpts from her father's diary about her death. And it is quite poignant in some of the most heartfelt writings that I have ever seen, certainly in Holliston and in any kind of literature. But Nancy at 16, she died of, as they said, consumption, which kind of fills in for a lot of medical problems, be it usually known as tuberculosis. Probably was that or any other disease. Could have been even leukemia, although I had no word for it, but the description on it was a wasting disease, as they said. So that's Nancy Dickinson. Keep her in mind. Now, as you notice, this kind of stone on this particular grave is very hard to read right now because it is done on sandstone, which does not stand the test of time as other stones in this graveyard have. And also facing up and getting all of the weather upon it. This is the marker for Holliston's first minister, the Reverend James Stone. And he is quite interesting. He was a graduate of Harvard Divinity. Part of the scholarship money that he received in order to get through school was from a man named Thomas Hollis, a benefactor of Harvard and a merchant of London. Mr. Hollis found in his uncle's papers that his uncle had been giving money to this school over in the colonies named Harvard College, a college who he found out soon also admitted Native American students. He thought this was a marvelous thing. So he sent 15 pounds per annum to this particular college in order to get a divinity school up and running. So the thing was that this all happened at a time when a part of Sherburne, Massachusetts, the western part of it, was petitioning the Great and General Court in order to become West Sherburne a precinct of the town of Sherburne, so that the political part of it would remain the same, but that they could build a meeting house out here because it was so inconvenient and difficult on Sundays to get all the way to that meeting house in the eastern part of Sherburne. It was really tough on Sunday mornings. It was awful. But as they were finagling and wrangling about that in the Great and General Court, in comes the announcement that 1,500 pounds per annum is coming from Thomas Hollis from London in order to start this divinity school. Isn't this wonderful? And the Great and General Court says, that's great. Tell you what, you know the petition from Sherburne? Lob that off, make it a town, and we're going to name it Holliston after Thomas Hollis. Anybody that was living out here said, Thomas who? They had no idea. They were caught off guard. Now they have to start their own political government. They got to have the church and they got to get schools going. Oh my God, you get this all together. And there was only about 11 men. Remember, women, we could not vote or become part of the political life of Holliston. There were only about 11 men to take up all of these jobs. So each one of them got, all right, you're going to be town clerk, and tell you what, we'll also make you like a selectman. You can also worry about the fence. Okay, you got 3? All right, I'll give you 3. And things got off to a little bit of a slow start. The colony also fined Holliston for not getting their schools going fast enough, heaven forbid. But things finally got rolling, and in 1727, in comes James Stone, newly minted minister out of Harvard College, who had went there partly on the money of the scholarship in the Hollis Foundation, but also because his father was a great cheesemaker in Newton. But that's another story. All right. Now, this stone has marvelous things front and back. And you will see for you on this side, there's a nice blank end here, but on the back of this one gives the whole rendition for the Morse graves. This is Henry Morse on this side, but I am going to talk about Mehetabel, who is right here. She, according to this stone, was the first white child born in Sherburne. Remember, when she died in 1681, this was Sherburne. So there she is here. Henry Morse, of course, is another grandfather of Holliston, and all of the Morses along here. All of these stones, as you notice, are marble and were placed in the 19th century when this type of stone was popular because, of course, in the early years you would either have a wooden stone or other sort of marker that was rather rudimentary, and to their best knowledge, these people were buried here because, after all, in 1681, which is quite a few years before 1724, there was no meeting house here. Where they are buried, it's hard to determine. They may be buried in the old graveyard in Sherburne, which would be highly likely, but because the Morse family became prominent in this end of Holliston, the Morse family, put up a bunch of memorial stones to their ancestors, which was a very popular thing in the middle of the 19th century. when people were starting to become more interested in the genealogy and also in local history. So, all of these lovely markers, which actually not standing the test of time as well as slate, but marble, of course, was quite ostentatious back in those days. It was quite popular. Now, Sergeant Silas T. Cobb, he was the sentry at the Anacostia River Bridge on the night that John Wilkes Booth got on his horse and escaped from Washington after shooting and killing Lincoln. He talked his way through and got to the other side, and away he went. If you read books about the Lincoln assassination, he shows up quite prominently. Oops, let him through. But anyway, another thing about this marker and this stone here, of course, he was a Civil War veteran, of course, along with his brother who was killed in action. Silas T. Cobb actually is not buried here. The papers you will receive later will tell you a bit more of the story. After the war, as many, especially young men did, they would light out for the West and head out and seek their fortune in the Great Lakes area and the plains and eventually on to, of course, California. I don't know where Silas was headed. What we do know is that he got as far as Michigan, Grand Haven, where he, along with 3 other people, including a friend of his from Holliston, the 2 guys were together and heading out, got into a boat to ferry across the river there, and the boat capsized and they all drowned. His body was never found. It is presumed that his body was washed out into Lake Michigan somewhere. So he is not here. We had quite a time establishing that. But thanks to nowadays you can get digital newspapers online and it's much easier to do this kind of research, we did find a couple of notices in papers around the country which did tell us just what happened to Silas. The family put up a standard U.S. military issue stone at least to mark him. He is not here, but we know where he is. That's Silas T. Cobb. So that is our first of the Civil War veterans we're going to talk about. The second one is directly behind. Now he's one of those stones that when you're in slow traffic, I want all of you to pay homage to Sewell H. Fisk, one of our most prominent Civil War veterans. He died in 1862. Now, one thing that we ought to take a look at first is the dates. He was born in 1810. He died in 1862. The cutoff date for volunteers for the Civil War was 43. When you check his name out in Mass Soldiers and Sailors of the Civil War, you will see his age listed as 43. What brought Sewell H. Fisk to volunteer, Company B 16 Regiment Mass Volunteers, to sign up and go to war at that such advanced age? Well, I'll tell you, he had a little bit of bone to pick with the South. Personal. It was all personal. Before the war in the 1850s, he had left Holliston, had traveled down to Savannah, Georgia, and he had opened up a dry goods store there. Things were going pretty well until some sort of suspicion fell upon him there that he was accused of teaching African-American slaves to read, particularly the Bible even, heavens. And so one night, a rabble broke into his home, dragged him out, dragged him up into the swamp someplace outside of Savannah, and they tarred and feathered him, which was no good thing. That has been written up. William Lloyd Garrison, the great abolitionist, recounted the story in some of his writings as well. So Sewell Fisk was an angry man when the Civil War came around, and he went back in order to settle scores, as it were. Unfortunately, though, He was not killed in battle, but he died of a disease at a hospital in New Jersey while he was attempting to get back to Holliston. They were shipping them north and shipping them north. But his body was brought back to Holliston for burial here. So, give a little salute to Sewell Fisk. He did what he could. So, next we are going to go up to another stone straight ahead here. This is Elbridge Jefferson Cutler, Holliston's great poet of the Civil War era. Now, he was the son of a well-to-do man. Elihu Cutler lived in the grand house that's on Washington Street, right there at the corner of Linden Street, the one that kind of just sits there on the edge of the hill. This is where he grew up. Elbridge Jefferson Cutler, professor in Harvard College. He was born 1830.
He died at 40.
Yes, he did. 2 days before his 40th birthday, while he was a professor at Harvard. At one point, he had vied for the position of the president of Harvard. He didn't make it, but he was well suited to the job. He was a professor of modern languages. Elbridge Jefferson Cutler had wanted to join the local regiment and go off to war, off to the Civil War. It's probably a pretty good thing he didn't. Apparently he was of a delicate constitution. Don't quite know what that means. Anyway, he arrived a couple of days too late after the local regiment had already left town, much to his disappointment. He stayed in Holliston, taught at the local academy that was located right up on the hill, and waited out the war. And there was another reason why he kind of had to lay low in Holliston, was that in 1861, at the First Battle of Bull Run, he wrote a very, very dashing and emotional poem that was read at the Phi Beta Kappa Society at Harvard, which caused so many young men, inspiring them to join up with the ranks for the Civil War. Now, if you go into Memorial Hall at Harvard and you look at the names of the students who died in the Civil War, perhaps there's some reason that he might have had something to do with that. But the problem was that although it stirred everybody in Cambridge, the papers picked up the poem and published it, including papers down in the South. And it became an even more popular poem in the South than in the North, which was quite embarrassing to him, as you can figure. So poor Elbridge J. Cutler died at Harvard and came out here to be buried with his family. Now, another little sideline on him is his brother James Cutler, who became a teacher. He was his younger brother, who he attained some fame later on as a tutor to well-to-do young students in New York City. And among his students was somebody quite notable by the name of Teddy Roosevelt. Now remember, Teddy Roosevelt was a weakling. He had asthma and he was physically a wreck when he was a kid. Cutler encouraged him to pursue athletics, took him on hunting trips up into Maine, and got him built up. And as you know, Teddy Roosevelt was one of these really great people that was really big on physical education, physical culture, and also defended the game of football that Harvard College, which Teddy also had attended, that Harvard wanted to eliminate it from their athletic program. And he wrote a very stirring defense of the game of football. Go figure. Behind here is a large obelisk which is dedicated to the Leland family. Now, as you know, the War of 1812 took place around 1812, but that was a very unpopular war in New England. And as a matter of fact, if the war had gone on much longer, the New England states were seriously contemplating joining Canada instead of staying with the U.S. But luckily, the war stopped just in time to save the Union, as it were. And apparently, Oliver Leland, who ran the tavern at that time in Holliston, one of the main ones, there's more than one, really, but Oliver Leland had a tavern. He resided in the house which is now 939 Washington Street. It's a hip-roofed colonial, who actually was moved just a little bit to make room for the Victorian houses next to it. But Oliver Leland, when that war was over, apparently held such a wild party at the tavern that his wife complained that there was more noise at that party than there was noise in the War of 1812. And she was disgusted with it, absolutely disgusted with what he was doing. So there's Oliver Leland. So I bet he would have been a great party guy, I think so. All right, now we're going to pass by the Batchelder line. All of the Batchelders, of course, were shoe manufacturers. There were 3 brothers who manufactured shoes, but there was one brother, George. He cultivated cranberries. But that's the Batchelder legacy that comes to Holliston. They were actually from Hampton Falls, New Hampshire, and William, the oldest, came down, started shoes. John came after, and Benjamin as well. And George, the youngest, came down and actually started growing cranberries in Holliston, and it became the major agricultural crop in the 19th century in Holliston's history. So you can still see vestiges of the cranberries around town. They never did go away, but they have gone a little underground. Next, remember Nancy Dickinson, who is buried down there. Here is her father, Timothy Dickinson, 3rd minister of Holliston. Timothy Dickinson didn't have it easy when he came to Holliston. He was a very well-educated man, and he was coming to a flock that was very undisciplined because the previous minister had spent most of his tenure here on a sickbed. So that the deacons became very independent, as well as the rest of the parishioners. He was trying to bring them together and discipline them, and they definitely pushed against it. He had a very tough time. One day even, the deacons locked the door of the church in order that Mrs. Dickinson could not hold her Sunday school class there. They ranted against him. They made his life very difficult. So, and all on top of that, losing several children to illness, having a very depressing time in Holliston. I have a lot of sympathy for Timothy Dickinson. Trying to discipline these people, bring them into the fold, was a very difficult job in Holliston. Now, after he died, if you remember, Elihu Cutler, Elbridge's father, had brought all of the deacons and the parishioners together because they needed to choose a new minister. And at that time, there was the movement, the religious movement in America, especially in the Boston area, where the Orthodox congregational churches were splitting and going either congregational and Unitarian. The split was successful in Sherburne. That's why you see 2 churches there, Pilgrim Church and the First Parish on the Hill, which is the location where the original church was. But in Holliston, Elihu Cutler, a man of great standing in town, saw that there was so much arguing and vitriol about it that he felt that the people could not handle doing such a split, even though it was rumored that Elihu himself was leaning towards the Unitarians. So once Dickinson was gone, though, what to do? Do we go through the split? Do we go with a congregational minister, as they had always done, and then anger another half and faction in the church? What do you do? He worked both ends of it. He would have been a great politician. Worked one side, worked the other, and I don't want to say tricked, but he kind of got both of them to agree on the same choice, unbeknownst to the other side. And what they did was, he did not offer a Congregationalist or a Unitarian minister. He offered up a Presbyterian. Go figure. But Timothy Dickinson, he has a marvelous diary which we still have available. There is a copy in the archives room at the town public library, which makes fabulous reading on a rainy Saturday afternoon if you are ever looking for something to do. But it tells a lot about the history of Holliston and about the people who lived here, about the people that he ministered to, and you can get a lot of history about others that we might never have known about. One of them, who he spent quite a bit of time, according to his diary, was with Sambo Freeman, who was an emancipated slave who lived in Holliston. He was a master carpenter who probably had a lot to do with many of the houses in Holliston. And he ministered to Sambo's last days before he died. Now, the person that we're going to be talking about is Harding Daniels. It was reported in 1848 that as he was crossing the railroad, he, in his wagon, which was driven by a horse, of course, was struck by the train. And Harding Daniels is the first casualty of the railroad in Holliston. Of course, there were lots of accidents with wagons and carriages. A lot of them were tipping over and people were dying. But this was the first time with a machine that somebody had died in Holliston. So it's sort of a macabre little extra added note on that. So now, that is the stone that marks the grave of Sarah Twitchell. And back in the 1970s, you could see almost the whole thing. She is one of the sprightly angels. So the tree is swallowing up the stone. You can barely see any more of her. She was a very nice one. She was a very typical angel with the spit curl and all that sits right there and is now being enveloped by the tree. Now, behind here, this is the stone of Albert Boynton. He was a young child who died. You have the 19th century penchant for getting away from the winged effigies and the funny little faces that you see all carved in some of these. And you see the willow and the urn, which are symbols for eternity. But what I liked about this particular one is way down in the corner here. This is unusual. You don't see too many of this type of thing. This is the carver's name at the bottom of the stone. J. O'Connor, an Irish stone carver in the mid-19th century that was here. I don't know where he was, whether he was from Holliston or from the area, but you very rarely would ever see stones where you would actually see the name of the person who carved it. So that's an interesting one to notice. And as you notice, these slate stones are standing the test of time much better than the marble, which is much more granular and much more, and it's much more vulnerable to the weather than these stones are. These tend to invite a lot of the moss and lichens and whatnot that grow on it, but the other stones, air pollution and just plain weather tends to wear down a lot of the beautiful marble ones as well. So it's too bad, but we do have these. So thank you very much for coming here, and we're right on time.